research forum today. We have Rob Mentz and Karen Hannan coming to talk to us about the EXSCEL clinical trial. So Karen is a project leader here at the DCRI. She's been here for 25 years, run multiple clinical trials. And Rob is one of our cardiology heart failure attendings, works in clinical trials. He came to us from the Brigham and Women's Hospital to do his cardiology fellowship here and has been here since. So take it away, guys.
Great, thanks, Alex. So thanks for the opportunity to present today. We're going to be talking about the EXSCEL trial and some of the operational lessons we learned from it, but also I think some of the greater details on how this really fits in the scope of this landscape of diabetes studies. So this study was actually first designed back in 2010, and Karen's going to go through a lot of the story about the evolution over the course of the 7-year study, and really how much things changed while we were conducting this clinical trial. So we initially presented these results at the European Diabetes meeting back in September, and it was published simultaneously in New England Journal at that time. These are my relevant disclosures. So as this group knows well, the global burden of diabetes is immense and increasing. So this is one of the WHO slides that really shows the increase over time, and you can see across different world regions, but upwards of nearly 10% and increasing in terms of prevalence. So it's in this context that diabetes is associated with a number of cardiovascular complications, blindness, kidney failure, amputations, really all things that impact both quality and quantity of life. And this figure on the bottom demonstrates the association between diabetes as compared with non-diabetics for different cardiovascular outcomes. So for the vast majority of these, it's a twofold increased risk associated with diabetes, so really an immense problem. And in this context, the FDA has indicated the need to really demonstrate that these medications that we use to treat diabetes not only lower blood glucose, but actually have a safe cardiovascular profile, and then obviously the ideal situations where you can actually improve cardiovascular events. So the EXSCEL trial was designed back in 2010, and it's a large, pragmatic international trial that was designed to characterize the effects of this injectable. So it's a once-a-week injectable medication, and I'll go through some of the details behind what this is, but it's in patients that have diabetes on top of usual care. It was a double-blind, placebo-controlled trial that randomized patients to exenatide at a single dose of 2 milligrams once weekly, or placebo. And it was academically led here by the DCRI, as well as the Diabetes Trial Unit in Oxford. So to give some background on what is a GLP-1 agonist, so this is a summary slide that highlights in the bottom right, you can see some of the anti-diabetic effects, but importantly, additional preclinical and clinical work have demonstrated improvements in blood pressure, weight loss, as well as cardioprotective effects in patients with diabetes. I want to spend some time going through the pragmatic design features. I think this is a term that's commonly thrown around now as we think about the design of clinical trials. If we need a more pragmatic trial. And there actually were many features of EXSCEL that were quite pragmatic, particularly at the time of initially the design phase in 2010. But it was really designed to be integrated with usual care, where all background therapies were based on the guideline recommendations in local regions, which, as you can imagine, as you enroll patients in a global trial, there's substantial variation in these different guideline recommendations. And importantly, concomitant diabetes therapies were at the discretion of usual care providers. So you can envision that patients with diabetes are enrolled in a clinical trial, half of them are getting placebo, half of them are getting the active agent, that over time, those in the placebo arm need additional therapies to treat their diabetes since they're not receiving an active therapy in this context of the randomized therapy. So we do see significant changes in background therapies in these patients over time. And really the only limitation was you could not have concomitant use of another GLP-1 agonist. So really not having dual therapies with the active therapy investigated in EXSCEL. Some of the additional streamlined trial conduct features, so there really were broad inclusion and exclusion criteria. It was adults that had diabetes and pretty broad range of A1C, and I'll go through some of the additional risk factor profiles. Importantly, it did not enrich for elderly individuals. So at the end of my portion of the talk, before I hand it over to Karen, I'll go through the comparison to some of the other studies that have largely focused on older patient populations and did not include just a broad group of adults with diabetes. Importantly, for those interested in this space and with additional background knowledge, DPP-4 inhibitors, also a medication within a similar class to GLP-1 agonists, were permitted. So this is the only GLP-1 agonist study that allowed concomitant use of this, because this is what's being done in clinical practice, potential for both use of these agents. There was no run-in period in this trial, so every other one of these diabetes studies has a run-in period where patients have to demonstrate that they can take the drug, and then if they are able to tolerate it, take it, then they're randomized. So it's really different from the usual care setting. When we have a patient in front of us in clinical practice, we don't go through a run-in period with them before we ultimately decide their therapies. So EXSCEL, I think, gives a nice context of how we actually practice clinical medicine. Visits were every 6 months. So as we'll go through some of the lessons learned on the operational side, this has both advantages and challenges as we think about patient engagement and maintaining patients on their therapy and in the clinical trial for this long-term outcome study. This is more aligned with usual care but does offer challenges. Importantly, all efficacy and safety laboratory results, except for annual calcitonin, which is a blood test that the FDA had required, were collected as available from usual care. So this has some advantages as you think if patients are getting their routine labs in clinic, you put it in the case report form. But if something isn't being collected in usual practice, it's not available in the case report form. So this has implications as we think about placing this study in context, but now also importantly, as fellows and others come to us and say, can we look at this in the trial? And say, well, yeah, we can absolutely, but realizing LFTs, if they weren't collected as part of usual care, they're not in this data set. So some advantages as we think about streamlined conduct for patients with additional blood draws and the like, but some challenges as we analyze the data and have subsequent publications. So I'll just quickly touch on this and kind of get into the meat of the presentation. So it was targeted enrollment of approximately 14,000 patients worldwide. It was an event-driven trial targeting a minimum of 1,360 primary events for major adverse cardiac events, and I'll go through that on a subsequent slide. Visits after some initial visits were really every 6 months throughout the study duration. And then there was a safety period. So as we were approaching the end of the study and we're going toward database lock, we have patients coming off study drug and then have to have a 70-day washout period to look for safety. The key inclusion criteria I've pretty much already gone through. Importantly, it included patients at any level of cardiovascular risk, so both primary and secondary prevention, and targeted approximately 30% that did not have known cardiovascular disease. So this, I think, allows for broader generalizability as we think about the patient population with diabetes. Some of the key exclusion criteria, so patients with type 1 diabetes, as well as those with a significantly lower renal function, an estimated glomerular filtration rate of less than 30. So these are the primary and secondary endpoints. The primary endpoint was a 3-component MACE, cardiovascular death, non-fatal myocardial infarction, and non-fatal stroke. And I'll go through the hypotheses on the next slide. But there's a safety hypothesis. So this is in line with the FDA label or the FDA guidance. You have to basically show that this medication does not increase cardiovascular risk. So that's kind of the first check. But then also it was designed to look for superiority. So we wanted to go one step further and demonstrate that exenatide was superior with respect to this endpoint. The key secondary endpoints are noted here, the first of which was all-cause mortality. Then it was hierarchically tested. So you had to basically meet these co-primary endpoints for safety and efficacy, and then if met at an alpha of 0.05 could go through the subsequent endpoints. So this is just some of the details for the statisticians in the room as we think about sample size calculation. So to meet this, look at this safety evaluation, basically what that means is when you look at the hazard ratio, you want to be able to rule out the upper bound of the 95% confidence interval at 1.3. So 11 primary events would have allowed that, and then for superiority, again, targeting 1,360 primary events in this population. So in that context, we assumed an event rate of 2.2% per year, and then I envisioned and really calculated that at least 14,000 patients worldwide would give us that number. I'll just kind of jump over that. For those with interest in terms of designing pragmatic trials and thinking about safety and endpoint adjudication, this is a slide that took a long time to really distill down the complicated nature of how we collected events and safety signals. So in terms of the reporting, so non-serious adverse events, unless they were specific events of interest in this patient population, were not collected. Serious adverse events were documented in the typical fashion. And then there were clinical events of interest. So this was to really look at key safety events that had been considered in this patient population, things like pancreatitis and the like, but basically to really demonstrate a streamlined safety reporting that did not broadly collect every single adverse event in this patient population. In terms of the event adjudication, all components of the primary and secondary endpoints that we went through on the previous slide were adjudicated by many, many fellows and faculty over years and years. And Karen will present some of the statistics on how those numbers actually settled out. But all neoplasms and pancreatitis were also adjudicated. Here are the recruitment details. So 14,752 patients were randomized around the globe, which led to many of us traveling the world to really engage with our sites, PIs and coordinators and around as we conducted this trial. This, I think, is a very important slide that shows the breakdown in terms of withdrawal of consent and loss to follow-up. And Karen is going to go through the details of how, with the help of many of you all, we really drove down the numbers of withdrawn consent and loss to follow-up so that we could have outcome ascertainment on as many patients as possible. So at the end of the day, we had vital status known on 99% nearly of the population, with withdrawn consent and loss to follow-up of less than 5%. So jumping into the baseline characteristics, so this was similar to many of the other diabetes studies in this space. Patients tended to be about 60 years old, about 40% were women. There's a majority of white, about 3/4 were white, but did have 6% black, as well as contributions from other areas of the world, largely in terms of the Asian representation. BMI, this was an obese population, a BMI above 30, and it did include about 20% that had significantly lower renal function. In terms of the breakdown for cardiovascular disease, so again, we were targeting about 70% that had a prior cardiovascular event of MI, stroke, or peripheral vascular disease. And you can see here we achieved that, but also importantly had 30% as a result that did not have known cardiovascular disease. On the bottom of the screen, you can see about 17% that had heart failure. This has been a key patient population of interest since many of the different diabetes medications, some of them have shown to benefit heart failure, while others have shown to worsen heart failure. So importantly, we do have a large heart failure cohort in EXSCEL. In terms of the participant follow-up, the median study duration was over 3 years, and the study treatment duration was about 2.5 years. About 40% of patients over the long duration of the study did come off of medication. You can see that it's actually similar between exenatide and placebo. So the idea of giving yourself a once-weekly injection for a long course is one of the challenges of these medications. And a number of efforts over the course of the study were implemented to try to improve adherence. And I don't think we have it in our slide set today, but showing that early in the study we saw greater discontinuation, but really year after year we saw improvements in the discontinuation rate as patients were enrolled and had longer follow-up. The proportion of time on study medication was about 3/4 of the time. So I'm going to go through some of the kind of surrogate measures and then get into the primary endpoints. So this is looking at A1C between the two groups. I'll draw your attention to the axis. The lower bound is at 6.5. But what you see is in purple, when patients start on the randomized treatment with exenatide, you get a reduction in A1C. But over time, the two curves, in large part, actually do come back together as you have progression of disease, as well as the placebo patients getting additional background therapies added. This, I think, is an important slide that demonstrates over the course of the study, in the two groups, with the purple one being the exenatide group, the addition of background therapies. I'll draw your attention to two groups, the SGLT2 inhibitors and the GLP-1 receptor agonists. These are now medication classes where agents within these have been shown to improve cardiovascular outcomes. So we have disproportionate drop-in the placebo group of potentially agents that improve cardiac events. And we have ongoing work to really explore this. But I think an important component is we evaluate this, and as well as we plan future trials and thinking that it's probably important for diabetic patients in these newly developed studies to be on these background therapies that we know improve cardiac outcomes. Here's the data on weight change, and again, the axis, the nadir is at 90. But you can see there is a reduction in weight with this therapy. It's about 1.3 kilograms is the average difference. So not huge, but importantly, in a diabetic population that many of the agents actually increase weight, this is an important therapy that leads to weight reduction. And as we look at some of the other cardiovascular signals, so you do see a reduction in systolic blood pressure with exenatide. It's fairly modest at about 1.5 millimeters of mercury. But interestingly, you do see this increase in heart rate. And heart rate epidemiologically is associated, as it increases, we think about that being associated with worse cardiovascular outcomes. And you do see a slight increase with GLP-1 receptor agonists on the order of about 2.5 beats per minute. And we have ongoing work to really tease this out. But again, a reduction in systolic blood pressure and a slight increase in heart rate. To go through some of the safety data, the safety profile was quite good. SAEs were similar between the two groups. Similarly, in terms of SAEs leading to study treatment discontinuation. So pretty consistent and very safe profile as with other medications in this class. As we look at diabetes complications, I'll draw your attention to a couple of them. So in terms of any diabetes complications similar between the two groups, there was not an increase in retinopathy. Some of the other agents in the GLP-1 receptor agonist class actually you see an increase in retinopathy or eye problems in these patients. It's thought that some of that might be related to when you suddenly drop your blood glucose, that it leads to changes in the vessels of the eyes. So I think reassuring data here that we should approach in the context of how the safety data were collected in EXSCEL, and we can maybe explore that further in our discussion. But in terms of the renal profile, also very safe, numerically fewer macroalbuminuria events. In terms of hypoglycemia, this agent is quite safe. So in contrast to some of the other blood glucose lowering agents where you see more hypoglycemia, you really don't see that. It's very consistent safety profile, fewer patients with severe hypoglycemia. So really highlighting that in terms of, as we think about the appropriate armamentarium of what agent should we be using in a diabetic, this actually has a fairly safe profile in terms of hypoglycemia. Pancreatitis, this was an area people initially were quite concerned about this. Some of this, I think, may be related. These agents slow gut motility and can cause some discomfort that could lead to further testing, including blood work and CAT scans and the like. So there was this concern prior to developing this study that was there actually more pancreatitis, and we really saw a very safe pancreatitis profile with exenatide. In terms of malignancies, just out of interest, there was concern based on preclinical data in rats that GLP-1 receptor agonists may increase medullary thyroid cancer. And that was why the FDA had mandated collecting calcitonin measures, which are not a fantastic measure by any means in terms of evaluating for thyroid cancer, but that was the rationale behind it. And we really see over 14,000 patients, we had just a handful of medullary thyroid cancers, and there was no difference in calcitonin. So for any calcitonin experts in the room, we now have the largest biomarker repository on calcitonin. This is just showing the calcitonin change. There's basically no change over time with this therapy. All right, jump right in. Here is the primary endpoint. So in purple is the exenatide group, numerically fewer events for the primary endpoint of MACE. You can see the hazard ratio of 0.91. So again, in terms of excluding that upper bound of 1.3, really it's right at 1.00, so it meets the mark for non-inferiority. The p-value for superiority of 0.061, and you can imagine how we felt when we first unblinded these data and saw this, but I think really looking at the curves, if you look at the figure on the bottom, you see they're really quite similar, but maybe a little bit of a separation later, numerically fewer events, but not statistically significant in terms of superiority. As you look at the different components of it, the lack of a significant p-value on the right demonstrates really consistent signal for the different components of the composite endpoint. And now this was probably one of the most exciting features of this. So this is now looking at the key secondary endpoint of all-cause mortality. We see fewer events in the exenatide arm with a hazard ratio of 0.86 and a p-value, a nominal p-value of 0.016. So based on our statistical hierarchical testing, we cannot say that this is statistically significant since we did not meet the mark for superiority. But I think as a clinician and a researcher, I think this is important. We have a reduction in all-cause mortality, And I'll place the EXSCEL trial in the context of other agents in this class to, I think, provide further support for this benefit in mortality. As we look at cause-specific mortality, again, the middle is exenatide, placebos on the right. You see 6.9 versus 7.9% all-cause mortality. Cardiovascular death, fairly similar between the two groups, but these lower buckets of either unknown death or non-cardiovascular death, numerically fewer with exenatide. We have ongoing work to really tease this out about what was driving this mortality signal. Looking at just a forest plot of these key endpoints, you can see, in general, everything really consistent to the left of one supporting exenatide, but none of these, it was not powered to show statistical significance, but really demonstrating hazard ratio point estimates in support, except for hospitalization for ACS, which is right around 1. So in summary, before I really place this in context and then hand it over to Karen, so it met the mark in terms of the primary safety hypothesis with a hazard ratio of 0.91. We did not meet the primary efficacy hypothesis, just missing the mark in terms of the nominal p-value. The key secondary endpoint of all-cause mortality, I think this is something that requires further exploration and ongoing work is really looking at this, about a 14% relative reduction that, as I noted, is not statistically significant in the testing hierarchy. And then cardiovascular death is 0.88, and then you can see similarly for MI, stroke, as well as hospitalization for acute coronary syndrome, which you noted. And heart failure, importantly, we did not see really any signal, so safe with no increased risk of adverse events. So just in the last little bit here, to place this study in context, so there are a bunch of different studies that are coming out. I think increasingly as researchers, cardiologists, or other providers, we need to understand these different diabetes therapies. So these are the different GLP-1 receptor agonist studies, ELIXA, LEADER, SUSTAIN, and now EXSCEL. EXSCEL is the largest to date. It was not quite meeting the longest, as LEADER had a longer median follow-up duration. SUSTAIN was on the smaller side. But you can see on the far right, the primary endpoints here, the bottom three were all MACE-3. And EXSCEL was really the only one designed to test for superiority here. But now as we look at and really aggregate all these data, so this was a meta-analysis we performed and it's now published in Diabetes, Lancet Diabetes. You can see ELIXA on the top, it's a little bit of an outlier. It was a different patient population with ACS. But as we look at MACE for the other three studies, LEADER, SUSTAIN, and EXSCEL, really demonstrating a consistent benefit for MACE. And I think this is a really provocative slide here. If you look at all-cause mortality, again, ELIXA, a separate and kind of unique study as well as a unique compound with lixazenatide. But LEADER and EXSCEL, if you look at the hazard ratios, right around a 15% relative reduction with both of these agents. And I think importantly in EXSCEL, as we think about the generalizability of this, and the pragmatic design, really probably these are the data that apply most specifically to our patients as we think about this therapy. So putting this in perspective, these results show that once weekly exenatide is safe and it suggested a potential benefit actually with respect to all-cause mortality. And these cardiovascular mortality findings were consistent if we look, except for the outlier a little bit of the ELIXA trial, which had some important design differences, I think really demonstrating that GLP-1 receptor agonists are now an important therapy as we think about improving cardiovascular outcomes in patients with diabetes. So thank you guys. I'm going to hand it over now to Karen, who's going to go through the nitty-gritty on all the operational details. Thanks.
Thanks, Rob. I'm an ops person. Counting things is what I do. So I'm going to open up this part of the talk talking about the numbers for EXSCEL. Unlike many clinical trials, we had 4 sponsors in a row. So there was a lot of excitement around that. We had 2 different IVRS systems. As we switched sponsors, we had to switch IVRS systems. So we wound up with a new IVRS about 7,000 patients into the program. We had to repackage drug when the sponsor left. As Rob said, 14,752 patients, 687 sites in 36 countries for EXSCEL. In North America, we did enroll 3,708. When we switched from sponsor 1 to sponsor 2, there was a decision made to not recruit in India, so all the rest of us had to change our plans accordingly and increase recruitment. First patient was enrolled in June of 2010. We also had 2 times where we terminated recruitment. Most of the world terminated in March of 2015, but because it took us so long to get through the regulations in China, not least of which is because it was a new sponsor every couple of years trying to get approval in China, we allowed them some extra time to recruit their 300 patients. So China completed recruitment in May of 2011. And I just want to point out, I don't know who from Stats is online or listening, but whomever from Stats is here, congratulations once again on delivering top-line results 8 days post-database lock. There was a lot of missed sleep and meals at desks to make that happen. 177,261 patient visits. That's a lot of touch points for sites. Over 4,000 SAEs, 15,800 follow-up SAE reports came out of DCRI. We had 4,700 triggered CEC events. Initially, our scope was 1,000 SAEs and 1,200 CEC events, so we had a scope change along the way and had to add some additional resources. Our transition timeline. This helps you understand some of, I think when we talk about changing the trial and how things evolved over time, the difference in how we talk about different endpoints was reflected in the way some of our sponsors transitioned as well. So first patient, we had a joint sponsorship between Eli Lilly and Amylin, which is a small pharmaceutical, biotech pharmaceutical company. I don't remember what they actually were. And then in 2011, we talk about the divorce. There was a Lilly-Amylin divorce. And there was some debate and discussion as to whether Amylin could continue to fund this trial without the partnership of Eli Lilly. Luckily, Bristol Myers Squibb stepped in and said, we will fund the rest of this program for you, come on. So Amylin became a wholly owned subsidiary of Bristol Myers Squibb, and that became part of our contract language. Sites needed new reg docs, sites needed new contracts. We had to re-engineer regulatory for, at the time, close to 450 sites and start another 200 with a new set of reg docs with Bristol Myers Squibb. Then our friends at Bristol Myers Squibb said, we are selling all of our diabetes compounds to AstraZeneca. So in the middle of trying to transition out of Lilly, BMS is also transitioning all of their diabetes portfolio to AstraZeneca. So now we have 2 sets of competing priorities from BMS. They're trying to both make the trial work and get rid of the compound all at the same time. And then in January 2015, AstraZeneca assumed full responsibility, full sponsorship for EXSCEL. So just these next couple slides, I'm going to try and demonstrate some of the complexities of the operations. So within the Exenatide Alliance, that's our sponsor, our catchphrase for the sponsor term, Lilly was responsible for IVRS. Lilly had ownership for safety processing. Lilly did all of the safety reconciliation and distribution of SUSARs to sites. EXSCEL is our global partner in site management and monitoring outside of North America. They were partially managed by the Diabetes Trial Unit in Oxford. The DCI responsibilities were, as you can see here, data management, US site management and monitoring, the CEC, the biomarkers, biosignatures core lab, and ARO management in Canada. Statistics was managed by the Diabetes Trial Unit, wholly and completely. That includes DSMB review and analysis. And DTU was responsible for managing all of our committees, the DSMB, the executive committee, all of the key strategic leadership pieces. So now Lilly's out of the picture. We no longer have an IVRS vendor. We no longer have safety processing. So there's a whole lot of things that have to transition. The safety database, the Exenatide safety database moved to BMS. Safety event processing moved to DCRI. Safety event reconciliation, SAE reconciliation moved to DCRI. Global distribution of the SUSARs That moved to PARC-EXSCEL. DCRI at this point does not have responsibility for safety. But again, we've got 7,500 patients receiving study medication, continuing to randomize and recruit, and the whole goal was how do we transition to a new IVRS with as little disruption to active trial operations as possible. And then in 2014, the Diabetes Trial Unit decided that they were no longer in a position to perform operational statistics work, and that work and the final analysis work also transitioned to DCRI. So we're now 4 years in, and our statisticians are having to do a whole lot of reprogramming, rewrite the statistical analysis plan with a new sponsor in mind, and that was a significant change for us in terms of the work that we were doing. And also the way we talk about operational statistics here at DCRI is a little bit different than what DTU was doing. So we had to re-engineer a lot of how we look at our data to meet our guiding principles. And then AstraZeneca became the overall sponsor, and their partnership with Amylin, or wholly owned subsidiary of Amylin, became a wholly owned subsidiary of AstraZeneca. There wasn't a significant operational change, but again, as an organization, as a trial, we had to make some significant shifts under a different set of operational guidelines, because how AstraZeneca runs their show is very different than how BMS ran their show, and different still from how Lilly did. So the battleship that was EXSCEL had to turn once again to meet a new set of guidelines and procedures. I could talk ops all day long on this because I lived this for 5 years, but I'm not going to do that because I want to make sure we have time for questions. So there's just a few areas I want to talk about in terms of what we did internally here at DCRI over the 7 years of EXSCEL to better improve our commitment to our guiding principles. So we did have a few functional groups that had to shift along the way, both to meet the new sponsor expectations as well as to do better at what we know how to do. So things that weren't part of the initial plan or work scope or budget, but are important to us to deliver quality work. One of the key things we did within CEC, and for those of you that adjudicated events for CEC know this experience, we looked at our negatively adjudicated events differently. As was alluded to before, I've been here a long time. I have been here since February of 1993. A lot of the people that are called faculty now, I knew when they were fellows and couldn't find a trash can. So this is, these are some changes that have happened here. Initially, when you called something not an event, that was the end of it. But the way we look at things now, and what we had to do for EXSCEL, was to take a look at all of the events where we said this is not an event and assess why. 36 countries, variety of ways people archive their medical records or even have access to medical records for patients that they're not actually seeing. The hoops folks had to jump through to get an ECG, when an ECG is not a required document. We could get a report, but to get the squiggle on the paper in Hungary was darn near impossible. So that made it very difficult sometimes for our CEC folks to be able to make some decisions. So the first thing we had to do was assess whether the event was called a no because we didn't have adequate supporting source. The second thing that was assessed is whether or not, if an event was assessed no, did it belong on an alternate causal pathway? So is it related to the event or is it a whole different thing? And Neha, I know, touched a number of these, as well as some of our endocrinology friends. We talk about, we reviewed subdural hematomas and the event of a patient who, the narrative reads, patient went to a family picnic, was punched in his head by a brother-in-law. That's a very different causal pathway than someone who, potentially had a stroke or some sort of TIA at the family picnic. We knew the cause, and it was not related to some sort of internal vulnerability. But to have an event that was adjudicated as no, go through this assessment of, Does this belong in this group? Does it belong on an alternate causal pathway? And should it be reported elsewhere? Do we need to capture this as an SAE? Was a new partnership between CEC and safety, and an important one. And it feels good to be able to answer the question, did we capture all the safety events in all the places we should? And for those of you that had to review 2011 events in 5 weeks or less, we appreciate those late nights, early mornings, and pizza lunches. But the reality is, I don't think that those are going to happen moving forward because it feels like CEC is now doing this as part of routine. So the fellows who come in the next year or two who are looking at events and assessing them, that's just going to be part of the review. You just tick the box, alternate causal pathway suspected. Hospitalizations, this was a big difference for our clinical operations team. Generally, we do a risk-based monitoring approach, which means that we don't look at every single patient 100%. We do a piece of it. So looking at our risk, a patient who is seen and reports 0 hospitalizations, you can be pretty sure nothing happened to. But a patient who goes into the hospital, our case report form allowed for 1 primary discharge diagnosis. So you have an admit date, a discharge date, and a diagnosis. If the patient's in the hospital for 3 weeks, it's entirely possible that that discharge diagnosis doesn't capture all of the wonderful things that may happen to the patient that required them to spend some extended time in the hospital. So we did some source document review by sending our CRAs to our top 10 recruiting sites and look for cases where you had underreported events. So you may have reported chest pain, but there may also be a pneumonia or sepsis or some other significant infection or even some other significant event that happened that needed to be captured as an SAE that doesn't link back to that discharge diagnosis. Another significant quality risk that this trial faced was related to retention and study drug discontinuation. Our protocol estimate of study discontinuation was 1%. That is a combined loss to follow-up and withdrawn consent. As early as 2012, it became evident that we were trending in the absolute wrong direction to be at 1% at the end of the trial. And what was really hard for us at a trial level, when you look at some of these numbers here on the bottom, is recognizing that this was a hard place to keep your attention when we have to move IVRS systems. And we don't have time to worry about these 7 patients over here because we've got 7,000 patients that we need to manage through a new system. So it became really hard to keep retention at the forefront on an ongoing basis and keeping an eye and a weather eye on those numbers. But we did figure out that we needed to do something significant. Now, Rob alluded to some of this, but I'm going to talk about bug versus feature in our pragmatic trial design and some of the reasons why patients do clinical trials. This was a long trial. If you were randomized in 2010, you had this device that was very difficult to use. If you were to show up at your doctor's office today and your doctor were to put you on exenatide, you get this really nifty pen thing where you twist it and you shake it and then you're good to go. But for EXSCEL, you had to take the little white powder and take a diluent tube and you had to mix the drug yourself as a patient, shake it up and you're tapping things and then you've got to somehow put the needle on and then you inject yourself. Which for your average patient over the age of 60, my mom can't even work the YouTube thing. So to think about an older patient population having to mix their drug once a week, it's complicated. And it became very complicated for patients to manage. So we had a lot of patients drop off. The other challenge we had was, this is a drug that's available right now. You can get this drug prescribed to you, and even in 2010, you could get this drug. So, okay, Mr. Physician, sir, or madam, why would I take you're on this trial for a while, your daughter does some research, sometimes daughters do that, and you get online and you figure out you can get this drug. Why would you stay on a trial where there's a 50% chance you're not getting the drug when your doctor could just write you a script and you could be on it next week? If you think this drug will work for me, why can't I just take it? So that was also a reason why we had patients drop. We had a number of sites close. Sites close for a variety of reasons. Physicians retire, research clinics close. We've had, I won't go into some of the, and then he lost his license conversations, but we had a couple of those. And if you don't have a sub-investigator identified, those patients are lost. They're orphans. Ethically, legally, morally, you can't have a patient in a trial without a physician overseeing them. Ethically, legally, morally, there needs to be an IRB who is responsible for the general welfare of these patients and making sure that there's appropriate oversight of the research. So if you don't have an investigator, what happens to those patients and where do they go and how do we make sure at the end of the day we have vital status follow-up for them? The minimal study visits, patients aren't engaged, they have no reason to come back, particularly if they're off drug. Can you just please answer the phone so I know you're not dead? Those are the conversations we're having with patients, leaving voicemails. I just want to know you're okay. I just want to know you're okay. But people don't always answer the phone. We had 6 informed consent form updates over the life of the trial. 12 to 15-page document that you're asking people to sit down and review every time you have a sponsor change. So this isn't even just your risk profile has changed. This is now, everything stays the same, but it now says Bristol Myers Squibb, and you have to sign it. And now it says AstraZeneca, and you have to sign it in order to continue. So we had patients drop because they refused to sign one more document. And I think those are the highlights of some of the reasons. When patients withdraw consent or are lost to follow-up and it's marked in the database, we try to put together a very aggressive plan to have the CRAs follow up immediately. It's 36 countries. It's 687 sites. It wasn't practical to ask Adrian or Rob or the DTU to get on the phone and call the site. So we had to have the CRAs do some preliminary work. So we worked with our data management team and generated this email. Within 24 hours of a patient being marked lost to follow-up, the CRA was expected to get on the phone and find out why. Tell me why this patient is lost. Tell me where this patient is. When did you last hear from them? What have you done to find them? Did you call the hospital billing office? Because generally, if you follow the money, they know where to find the patient, even if they're not answering the phone. So those sorts of strategies that are really important that the study coordinator doesn't always think of. You know, they're not answering the phone when I call. Well, ask your billing office. They generally know. Look through your medical records. Are they being seen in the hospital and there's an entry somewhere? Withdrawn consent. Significant difference between I don't want to take your drug and I don't want you to know if I'm alive or dead. Those are two very different concepts. So to make sure that sites and CRAs are comfortable with the fact that they can have that conversation with a patient. Because the regulation says if a patient wants out, they're out. The other side of that, the AdCom side of that, is the FDA saying, tell me what you did to make certain that you had complete ascertainment of vital status. So part of what we had to do was build a program that allowed us to have those conversations. And this was an initial opportunity for the CRAs to get in early and say, you've said this about your patient. Is this the conversation you had? They may have said this to Susie's study coordinator, but what was the conversation the investigator had with the patient in the process of their withdrawal of consent? So I know this is a little bit tiny, but I want to talk about the work that the outcomes team did here at DCRI. So the outcomes team here at DCRI was brought in fairly late to the process because we needed to manage these patients that we had no chance to follow. So we talked with our central IRB and we said we had to set these patients as withdrawn consent, not because they wanted to necessarily withdraw consent, but because we had no appropriate oversight for them. We are not saying we want to contact the patients. What we wanted to do and what we were able to do is use a third-party locator service. We're not contacting the patients. These patients did not agree to be contacted. But we want to use a third-party locator service so we can demonstrate alive or deceased. We just want to know, are they okay? It doesn't let us get an endpoint assessment, but we were able to document alive versus dead for a number of these patients. And there's nobody at the site to enter the data. So that's kind of a problem. So what we did was bring in the outcomes team who would review the form from the third-party consultant, and they would enter the patient status into the database. They were trained on our ECRF and how to capture this data for the patients that were in this unique situation. And if we have another hour, I can talk about the regulatory process and all of the I's and T's that went into that. But that was a significant win for us. This had a significant impact on our overall vital status. We had 190 patients. Without using the DCRI outcomes team, we would have had a 2% loss to follow-up rate of 2% unknown vital status. The use of the outcomes team was able to bring that down to 1.2, which is very significant. And I just wanted to throw this up here just to kind of show the flow, and that will still give us some time for questions. So our total number of patients at the end of the day was 14,752. When we started closing the trial in February 2017, again, we had that 70-day washout. The mountain was high and it was steep in terms of capturing loss of follow-up and withdrawn consent vital status. So we had, as you can see, 390 patients that were lost globally, and 489 patients that we did not have vital status for in our withdrawn consent bucket. And as Rob showed on the consort diagram, and I threw the number up here, the end of the trial, we had recovered vital status for 14,581 patients, would put us really close to that 1%. So we were 98.8%. So that was some really significant work, and that was pioneered by our outcomes team. So that was a tremendous amount of gratitude for the folks that were able to consult with us and put those, dot the regulatory I's and T's and make that happen. So that's all I wanted to say about the operations, and I think we want to open it up to questions for the last 10 minutes or so.
The only other thing I'll say, so when I started on this study as a fellow, Adrian came over and asked me he said, you say you want to do trials, but you better learn how to do them. And this trial, just as Karen went through, it really taught you basically how to learn the lesson and see what goes into this in the making of the sausage, so to speak. And so when we published the results, the trial went on for 7 years. So my oldest son was 7. I joined the trial when my middle child was born, Becca. So that was 5 years. And over the course of the study, my daughter was born. So it really was a family affair. And I was up many late nights on the hotline, but learned so much thanks to Adrian and so many others in the room.
So, Rob, I was just curious, when the guidance came out for diabetes CV outcome trials, was envisioned to be useful to have pragmatic trials, EXSCEL being one of those. How do you see things going forward in terms of what the spirit of the FDA guidance and getting better information in terms of cardiovascular outcomes was on the spectrum of things? How well did EXSCEL fit into that pragmatic guidance or pragmatic spirit? And do you see, in the future, more pragmatic trials or less pragmatic trials?
Yeah, so great question. So understanding how EXSCEL fits into pragmatism and where do we go from here. So I think, as we tried to highlight a little bit at the beginning, I think EXSCEL had many features that were exceedingly pragmatic. Some almost to a fault in some sense. But I think it helped us learn the challenges around the safety reporting, the event acquisition, and some of the challenges particularly with keeping people on a drug and in the study. And I think the way things are moving are that it's not just enough to say this drug is non-inferior. But now as we have at least 2 diabetes medication classes that show actual reductions in cardiovascular events, I think there's going to be increasingly a push that yes, you can incorporate elements of pragmatism, but there are some elements that cannot be pragmatic. You're going to have to encourage background use of a lot of these therapies. And another key thing and I'm talking to the fellows tomorrow about diabetes and heart failure, so hopefully they're not overwhelmed by diabetes at this point, is other key endpoints like heart failure. So if you look at every single one of those studies, the primary endpoint is either 3 or 4 component MACE, but doesn't include heart failure. And since the time of the 2008 recommendations from the FDA, that landscape has changed. Now we have medications like the SGLT2 inhibitors that reduce heart failure events. So I think increasingly we need to incorporate other elements that may not be as pragmatic. But maybe I'll throw the question back at you, Adrian. As the Vice Dean for Clinical Research, where would you see pragmatism in diabetes studies in the context?
It's actually completely unfair. Well, I think, even more so there's strong interest because the FDA is now by law on the hook to develop a framework and guidance around real-world evidence that includes interventional trials. And so whether it's the Cures Act or PDUFA, they have a mandate to do this. I think one of the things that does come up, and Karen nicely illustrated this, is that so-called being more pragmatic doesn't always mean being easier. And so, but the goal here is how do you get closer to patients in terms of what's their decision making, what's the kind of broader population that's not the, say, 1% that traditionally enrolls into clinical trials, but closer to the 99% who don't. And so I think we want to enable that by good designs and also leveraging systems that can be better integrated in terms of clinical flow. So there are a lot of other people who've been around this world a bit, and Granger was part of GUSTA, which was one of the ultimate pragmatic trials. 3 CRF or 4 pages on CRF and a postcard outcome?
10 out of 41,000 patients lost to follow-up. I mean, it is amazing that we've, how in terms of the complexity, we've definitely gone the wrong way. Now maybe we're re-equilibrating a little bit. But I also wonder about, I mean, you guys obviously put a lot of energy into minimizing patients who didn't have vital status, but were like not nearly as complete as some other trials going on, like the COMPASS trial. They had only 0.2% of patients who didn't have vital status with 27,000 patients. And so do we understand why in some trials we have so many more withdrawal of consent and we can't get people to find the patients for us than others? Is it just the threshold that, I mean, in some trials, my sense now is, in some trials, some of us just ignore the regulations and just say, find out whether the patient's alive or not, irrespective of what the patient has said. And is that justifiable?
Consent form language. I think it's consent form language. I know one of the challenges that we faced with EXSCEL when we had discussions with the different regulatory bodies around the world trying to find our lost to follow-up patients, is there are certain countries that let us use the language we had and some that would not. And they actually were able to say, if your consent form said this, we would let you do this. But because it doesn't say this, you can't.
So what's the solution to that? How about if we just don't go to those countries?
That is on the table with some sponsors.
Yeah, because it's a real, I mean, it was pretty good here, wasn't it, in the end, due to all the work you did? But it
was expensive in terms of human resource. It was expensive intervention and a huge resource drain from data cleaning and data quality, because we had our best and brightest brains working on how do we find these 17 patients in Colombia, for example. But you were on some of those calls as well, so.
Yeah, I think it's a challenge, and with EXSCEL there were both specific challenges as well as more generalizable ones. And I think you're kind of walking this line to get to Adrian's point about pragmatism. So at the end of the day, would you rather have results where you have some missing patients, but the patient population is probably similar to what you see in clinical practice, and when you don't have a run-in period, that, you know, this is basically who you're seeing and who you're applying the therapy to. So it's this fine balance of the regulatory perspective, the clinician perspective, and the trialist that I think we all still really struggle with.
Yeah, I think Compass was highly pragmatic, but, so I'm not sure that's the full explanation, but it's a good point. Probably if you have a lot more events, then a few missing is less important.
And if you have a study that goes on for 7 years with visits every 6 months, it's a challenge. Yeah, Doc.
I think a piece of the challenge here was differentiating the people who didn't want to deal with messing with the drug from the people who didn't want to deal with the study. And those are two very different types of withdrawal of consent.
Right, withdrawal of consent for treatment versus withdrawal of consent for follow-up.
Right. And,
Right.
And even if we try with, there's been some effort to do additional forms. When somebody says, I want out, ask them what they want out of to give us permission to do the follow-up for events.
Yeah, I think that's one of the most important lessons from EXSCEL is, when patients say, I don't want to do anything with this study anymore, obviously it's always the patient's prerogative, they can do what they want, but really understanding what that means. And over the course of the trial, we developed an algorithm to really go through, all right, so you don't want to continue study drug. Would you come to your clinic visit still? If not, can we look at your medical record? If not, can we query it at follow-up? But that changed so much over the course of the study, but you're exactly right. Really teasing out what do they mean when they say, I don't want to be involved with the study, or I don't want to do drug. Neha, you were our fellow. What? Any insights?
On the withdrawal, on the withdrawal issue.
Or more broadly, some of the things
Yeah,
you've
probably.
learned.
It's one of the, oh gosh, hi, thank you, sorry, I got suppressed. And I don't know, Karen, what you think about this, but for the withdrawal of consent issue, I got the sense, and again, I only joined in the last 2 years, but I got the sense that it had something to do with how ticked off the patients were, right? So and this was such a trying process for these patients to go through so many reconsents and et cetera, that by the end, it just seemed like the feedback we were getting from the sites was, they're mad. And so if there's a way, we've learned so many things in this process, but I think we as a practice, we're moving more towards engaging patients and being more patient-friendly as we go through the process, and I think that's not something that we were necessarily thinking about 10 years ago or whatever when this trial was designed. And so I think that will help a lot as well to keep patients engaged in the entire process, and I think is going to be helpful. I did have a question that I wanted to get your thoughts on, Rob. So one is that along the lines of what Adrian was asking in terms of regulatory guidance, there's a question, right, as we go forward with these large cardiovascular outcome trials, do we really need another trial for every single drug, even if it's in the same class? If a prior drug in that class has shown benefit and has not shown maybe significant harm, do we need another trial, one of these huge outcome trials, for every single drug in the class? And that's something that I think the FDA is something that's being posed to the FDA, and I wanted to get your thoughts on that. Given what we've learned from EXSCEL compared with, say, LEADER, do you think that this needed to be done?
So I think when it was designed, it needed to be done. I think you're right, though, that the landscape has changed. And we want patients to be on right background therapy, but we don't need a 15, 20,000 patient study with agent X. But whether you need to have adequate events looking at cardiovascular safety, I think at some point, whether it's real world evidence. And I think one editorial comment on this, I think, as Adrian nicely highlighted, when we're talking to sponsors about pragmatic trials, they hear faster, cheaper, sooner. And they're all, many times can be completely aligned with this, but as they start to learn some of the challenges and as well as some of the strengths, then there might be less interest in it. So I think it's important as we move forward and really want to be the leaders in understanding what elements of pragmatism should we be doing, how can we be pushing on real-world evidence, the regulatory side, and important, these collaborations with sponsors, but probably even more important, like you highlight, patients. What do they actually want in terms of the evidence base to support the regulatory piece?
Oh, I think we have one
Great.
final
Dr. Rocco,
question.
one more
and
comment?
Then we're going to lose time, I think. So,
Just one
Frank.
more comment. I mean, you're
Yeah.
right, the spectrum of pragmatism is important. If I look at adaptable, there is no investigator. There is no case report form. Still a randomized controlled clinical trial, but it has a lot less depth than this, right? So there's no, I think your point, I agree with you, there's no free lunch here. You can, it's faster and cheaper, but if I were to calculate cost per information unit, I don't know that it's actually any cheaper. I'm just collecting a lot less information. Maybe that's okay. Yeah. So I think you need to think about it in that sense.
Yeah, well stated. Thank you all. That's good.